Bad Girls, Donna Summer. I started to notice a certain type of girl hanging around the downtown club scene. I won't call her a groupie, but she had elements of that. She was someone looking for excitement, driven by a need to feel special, eager for recognition despite no discernible talent, and inclined to sleep with anyone in a band. Like me, she came from a place she wanted to escape. Bit by bit, I began to draw a mental picture of this girl and realized she would be the protagonist of my movie. I sorted through the pile of notes I'd written over the years to see where they would lead. I wanted the film to deal with the complications of love and romantic disappointment, attraction and manipulation, and I wanted the plot to be a little bit messy because life was messy. My protagonist would be a narcissistic young woman caught between two men, one sweet and malleable, the other a sexy manipulator. I decided to name her Wren because she would be a bird-like creature who flies fast and keeps moving until she finds a place to land. Wrens build nests in old tree stumps, crevices of buildings, parked cars, flower pots, drain pipes, even shoes. They are scrappy survivors. I remember my father saying to me when I was a smart-aleck kid, "So, tell me something new." That phrase stuck in my head. I wanted to create a female protagonist that movie audiences hadn't seen a gazillion times before. I wasn't concerned about whether Wren was likable or sympathetic. I wanted her to be compelling, even infuriating. My favorite male movie characters always had a combination of good and bad qualities. Ratso Rizzo in Midnight Cowboy, Benjamin Braddock in The Graduate, Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver. There needed to be more guy roles for women. I was also inspired by the multifaceted female characters I'd seen in European films. Roles for actresses in Hollywood movies of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s fell into two basic categories: the good wife or devoted girlfriend, or the slut or whore. This was infuriating after the heyday of great female roles in the melodramas and screwball comedies of the 30s and 40s. Post-World War II American cinema had created heroic male characters, but put women back in the kitchen or the bedroom. I watched the films of Jean-Luc Godard starring his wife and muse, Anna Karina. I wanted to be her. I watched the films of Claude Chabrol, mesmerized by his wife and muse, Stéphane Audran. I fell in love with the early movies of Federico Fellini because of the performances of his wife, Giulietta Messina. In Nights of Cabiria, Messina played a waifish prostitute, living in a hovel and roaming the streets of Rome looking for love, but finding only disappointment. The film would win an Oscar for Best Foreign Film in 1957. The grittiness of Fellini's bombed-out, post-war Italian neorealist settings reminded me of the dilapidated buildings and rubble-strewn lots of the Lower East Side in the 1970s. And although the film's subject matter was dark, the story sparkled with touches of genuine humor and hope. I loved that mix, dark and light. That was the tone I was looking for. But what I liked most was the pluckiness of Cabiria, the character that Giulietta Messina played. Her attitude, determination, even her wardrobe would inspire the character of Wren. Here are a few things I knew about Wren. She would have the gutsiness of Cabiria, the near-delusional ambition of Holly Golightly, and the self-destructive spark of the archetypal punk groupie Nancy Spungen. She would be hungry for fame, but her best creation would be herself. She would use her day job working at a Xerox copy shop to make photocopies of her face, selfies before they had that name, with the caption, "Who is this?" She would plaster them all over the walls of the East Village. It would be her way of saying, "I exist. Pay attention to me." She would be a precursor to a generation of famous-for-being-famous social media influencers 25 years later, a legend in her own mind. I wanted to create Wren without judging her. There have always been girls like Wren, boys too, young people coming to the big city with the dream of reinventing themselves, nobodies who want to be somebodies. And I admired Wren's resilience. When she got knocked down, she picked herself back up. Wren was no crybaby. Because I didn't have much money, I decided to turn my financial limitations into an aesthetic. I was not looking for technical slickness or perfection, nor could I have achieved it. I was looking for the right edge, the right tone. The film's cheapness would become its style. The gritty streets, the crumbling buildings, the garbage-strewn sidewalks, and the graffiti-covered walls would be an important part of the production design. Even though I'd been out of NYU for 3 years, I'd stayed in touch with some of my former classmates. I told them I was going to make a low-budget film. Since we'd had a good working relationship on my student films, they came on board. Little by little, the pieces came together. The notes, scribbled on scraps of paper, turned into a 100-page screenplay, and I set out to make a movie. All I needed was to find Ren. I began the casting process following a traditional route. I placed an ad in Backstage, the weekly newspaper read by New York actors looking for work. This is how many student films were cast at the time. Aspiring director seeking aspiring actors to work on their films for free. I received hundreds of headshots. New York had no shortage of young hopefuls looking for a break. I sorted the photos into piles, then held auditions in a borrowed theater space in Times Square. There were a couple of potentially good candidates, but none had the edge or the scrappiness I was looking for. They seemed to be acting the part, but lacked the authenticity. An NYU friend of mine named Yossi happened to go to an off Broadway performance by an experimental theater group that was held in an abandoned downtown loft. Apparently, there were more actors on stage than people watching in the audience. The show was forgettable, but he spotted an actress he thought was unique. He gave me her phone number, and I called. We agreed to meet the following week. The moment she entered the room, I sensed she had the gamine quality I was looking for. I also knew it was fate that her name was Susan. Susan Berman. I had a thing about names. I had a thing about Susans. In the end, Smithereens would take over 2 years to make, with several starts and stops and many complications along the way. Some of the problems were beyond my control. Some were financial setbacks I knew I'd eventually encounter, like running out of money. Sometimes I felt like a punch-drunk boxer waiting for the next blow. But each time it looked like the project would collapse, it made me more determined to get it made. I'll show you. One Way or Another. Blondie. On our 5th day of filming, Susan Berman fell off a rickety 4th-floor fire escape during a rehearsal. She dropped 15 feet and could have easily been killed. Fortunately, she only broke her ankle, but it was a bad break that required her to be in a plaster cast for 4 months, and the film came to a screeching halt. I felt terrible for Susan. Thankfully, she would be fine. I also felt sorry for myself. I'd already spent 1/3 of my production money, and there would be nothing to show for it. I feared the cast and crew would all go their separate ways, and the whole endeavor would have been a total waste of time. What I didn't realize was that Susan's accident actually saved the movie. It gave me a chance to assess what I'd filmed, to see what was working and what wasn't, then adjust the script moving forward. The scenes with Ren alone on screen were powerful. We had created a unique character, and Berman brought her to life. But the scenes with Ren and the French actor I'd originally cast as the male lead had no spark. It was no one's fault, there just wasn't chemistry between them. If Susan hadn't broken her ankle, and I'd stuck with the original version of the script, I'm sure the film would not have been very good. It would have come and gone, and with it, my future directing career. But during the 4-month hiatus, while Berman was recuperating, I decided to rewrite the script, with the help of an aspiring screenwriter named Ron Nicewaner, whom I'd recruited by cold calling Columbia University's screenwriting department and asking the kid who happened to answer the phone if he had any suggestions. I lucked out finding Ron. I then recast the male lead, taking that character in a totally different direction. That's how bad luck can turn good. Richard Lester Myers, a.k.a. Richard Hell, the lead singer of the Voidoids, was a Lower East Side celebrity. But despite his downtown fame, he was usually broke and hustling for money. He had a louche reputation that he fully lived up to. Richard had been in several influential bands, Television with former friend Tom Verlaine and the Heartbreakers, that played regularly at CBGB and combined poetry with posturing. He had written the punk anthem Blank Generation and, according to downtown mythology, was credited with having created the punk ethos before the Sex Pistols, Malcolm McLaren, and other British bands appropriated it. It's claimed he was the originator of the proto-punk fashion of ripped-up t-shirts held together by safety pins. Somehow, we met through a friend of a friend of a friend. Richard had heard I was looking to recast my film, and he was probably hoping there would be some money in it. We chatted on the phone, then he dropped by my, Jan's, apartment. The first thing that struck me was his cinematic look. He was tall, thin, and handsome, with spiky hair and shabby glamour. We talked about filmmaking, and I was surprised to find out he was a serious cineast. He had worked at Cinemabilia, the best film bookstore in town, and had an extensive knowledge of movie history. He had come from an academic family. His mother was a professor, and he'd been a prep school dropout. He said he needed rent money and asked if the job paid. I told him no one else in the cast was getting paid, true, then offered him $200 a week for 3 weeks of part-time filming. He was a smoker, so I threw in a professional teeth cleaning. Richard would play Eric, a diabolically seductive version of himself, and I wanted to capture his sexy bad boy allure on film. Once Susan Berman got out of her plaster cast, I was able to pull the crew back together, and we continued filming in 1-week spurts due to weather and financial considerations. I would pepper the film with interesting people I'd met along the way: actress and writer Cookie Mueller, indie filmmaker Amos Poe, the singer and punk Bridget Bardot, Kitty Summerall. When I ran out of money, I would stop to find more. But shooting in stops and starts also had its advantages. It enabled me to edit and make story adjustments as I went along. The tricky part was trying to hold the cast and crew together over the stretch of a year. Thankfully, I'd inherited my mother's relentless optimism and didn't give up easily. Jan's 3-bedroom apartment in Silver Towers, where I was now living alone, became a combination production office and crash pad. There was a steady stream of colorful characters and oddballs coming and going. The script supervisor, my cousin Ira, slept on the couch in the living room. One of the assistant directors slept on a pull-out sofa in the back room, and Richard Hell occupied the middle bedroom on the nights when he was filming the following day. It was a way to ensure that he would show up on set in the morning, clean, sober, and on time. But as it turned out, my concerns were unwarranted. Richard was very professional when he wanted to be. My naivete about filming in New York City turned out to be an asset. I didn't know you needed film permits to shoot on New York City streets, so we had none. We just ran around the city like outlaws, stealing locations, filming wherever we needed to, letting nothing get in our way. We shot the opening title sequence on the subway starting at 2 a.m. with our camera hidden inside a travel bag. There were 6 of us, and we rode the trains all night until we got all the footage we needed, jumping on and off the train whenever we spotted a transit cop. One night, we were filming a scene in Times Square, which was still pretty squalid at the time. Most of the light on 42nd Street came from the neon-lit marquees of the triple X-rated movie theaters along the street. This was still 2 decades before the area would be pedestrianized and turned into a Disney-esque theme park. It was a scene where Ren and Eric, desperate for money, rob a tourist at gunpoint inside a taxicab. It was hard to rehearse the scene in advance, and we didn't have a taxi at our disposal. So the actors and a small crew of 4, cameraman, sound recordist, camera assistant, me, hailed a random cab on 42nd Street. I offered the driver $50 and asked him to drive in circles around Times Square while we all squeezed into the taxi to film. During a break in the shooting, while Shireen, the cameraman, was reloading his camera in the doorway of a peep show, I handed the prop gun to Ira, our script supervisor, for safekeeping. A pedestrian must have seen him standing there holding a gun and called the police. The next thing Ira knew, he was surrounded by cops with their weapons drawn. Luckily, he managed to talk his way out of being handcuffed and thrown in the back of a paddy wagon on a weapons charge. The cops then left, and we continued filming. Our key location was an abandoned, rubble-strewn lot around 47th Street, near the West Side Highway. This was a deserted stretch of highway well known as a cruising spot for hookers, and there were plenty hanging around, as well as the sketchy characters who watched over them. This is where the character of Paul, a drifter from Montana, played by actor Brad Ryan, lived in his graffiti-covered van, parked in an empty lot. During pre-production, I had met a young Puerto Rican kid, a subway graffiti artist named Lee Quinones, and asked him to paint Paul's van in his signature style. I bought the spray paint and paid him $100. A few years later, after graffiti art became popular, Quinones' work would be in major museum collections around the world and auctioned for big bucks at Sotheby's. Regrettably, the old van he spray painted for smithereens had been junked as scrap metal. When I was unable to find cheap long-term parking in Manhattan, I'd asked my father if I could keep it temporarily parked in his driveway in Huntington Valley. But when the neighbors complained it was an eyesore, he had it shredded. One of my favorite scenes featured an actress named Catherine Riley playing a zonked-out prostitute who propositions nice guy Paul when she finds him sitting alone at night in his van. The dialogue, thank you, Ron Nicewaner, went like this. Hooker. Hi, you recognize me? I'm always hanging around the corner when you walk by. Me and my friends always wave at you. Listen, you want me to keep you company for a while? $20. Paul. I don't think so. Hooker. You want me to go down on you? I'll do that for 15. With my hand, it's only 10. Thanks anyway, but I don't think so. Well, can I just sit here for a while? It's cold outside. She makes herself comfortable in the front seat. Crazy weather, huh? One day it's hot, next day it's freezing. I guess you gotta be outside a lot? Yeah, well, it's the nature of my business. You hungry? She pulls a brown paper bag from her handbag, takes out a sandwich. No, I don't want to eat your dinner. You're letting me sit in your truck. Go ahead. I got an egg in here, too. It's chicken salad with mayonnaise. My mother made it. Reluctantly, Paul takes a bite. They eat in silence for a moment. I visited my mother the other day. Boy, was that a trip. She's sweet, but I think she's getting a little senile. How's the sandwich? Good. So what do you do? Portraits? I draw portraits. I'm not an artist or anything. I just do it for the money. Yeah, well, don't we all? They chat for a while, then the hooker gets ready to leave. Look, you sure you don't want to get it on with me? I got a scar. I'll show it to you for $5. A scar? It's in a really interesting place. Thanks, but I don't think so. This was the type of scene that didn't really advance the plot, but spoke volumes about the characters and mood, which was why I liked it. And Catherine Riley's deadpan performance as a sentimental hooker was brilliant, both funny and sad. Unfortunately, this would be her last film role. She died 4 months before Smithereens was released and never got to read the rave reviews her performance received. Occasionally, a few of the real-life prostitutes would stop to chat, curious to check out what we were doing. And I realized that there was an alternate world of night crawlers who only came out after midnight. Hookers and rent boys, night shift taxi drivers, road maintenance crews, and the clubgoers who frequented the mysterious after-hours spots that didn't open until 4 a.m. We had temporarily become part of that secret universe. Someone with a gun could have easily shot us and stolen our expensive rented camera equipment. We were filming in no man's land, late at night, without protection or security. We were young and reckless and naive. Creativity was the invisibility cloak that protected us. I will survive, Gloria Gaynor. Around this time, I had to leave Silver Towers. I had overstayed my welcome, and Jan wanted to move back into his apartment with his new girlfriend, and besides, I had no legal right to be there. So I moved farther south to a converted office building on Maiden Lane, near Wall Street. Since artists had been moving steadily south from Greenwich Village to Soho, then farther south to Tribeca, I thought the Wall Street area would soon become the next artsy hotspot. I was wrong. During the day, Wall Street was crowded with stockbrokers, lawyers, secretaries, and office workers. By 6 p.m., like clockwork, everyone went home and the streets were deserted. The coffee shops and fast food joints that fed the office workers closed early. There were few grocery stores and no supermarkets, since this was not a residential area. If I ran out of milk, I went to the local Bun and Burger on Broadway and pocketed a handful of those free mini plastic containers of half and half, then watered them down to use with my cereal. My refrigerator was empty except for individual-sized packets of mustard, ketchup, pickle relish, and duck sauce. My apartment was pretty much devoid of furniture, since I'd given most of my old stuff away. I did have the big gray velvet sectional sofa that Jan and I had bought together that now looked lonely in my empty living room. The apartment had a tiny Juliet balcony, big enough for a folding chair and the plastic cube I used as a coffee table, and had a spectacular view of the Twin Towers only 1 block away. I would sit outside at night with a glass of wine and gaze at the magical cityscape, shimmering glass and chrome. Lights twinkled in thousands of empty offices where immigrant cleaning crews worked all night. That's the powerful and humbling thing about living in New York City. You are one speck of light in a gigantic grid. There were millions of stories out there, each as unique as your own. Looking out at the towering World Trade Center, I could never have imagined what would happen there 20 years later and that I would witness it firsthand. I rented a Steenbeck editing table and put it in my living room. It was nearly the size of a professional Xerox copy machine with a monitor on top. I would thread the reels of celluloid film and magnetic sound through lots of gizmos, then physically splice and tape together the pieces I wanted to use. Plastic bins of outtakes, dangling bits of celluloid, were scattered about the room. My schedule was erratic, but I liked working best at night when the neighborhood was eerily quiet. I turned into a zombie. Anyone who has worked on a passion project knows the feeling of waking up at 3 a.m. with a sudden idea and leaping out of bed to jot it down before the thought vanishes. In my case, running over to the editing machine to try it out. I spent months in my pajamas. I had run out of money and still had lab bills, editing bills, and sound mixing bills to pay. I borrowed more money from my father and persuaded my Uncle Arnold to lend me $5,000, promising both they would be repaid shortly. I had no idea how, but I had no choice but to believe in myself. If I didn't, who would? It was around this time that Ron Neiswaner met a director named Jonathan Demme, who had just made the movie Melvin and Howard. It received great reviews and won 2 Oscars. Ron put me in touch with Jonathan, who offered to take a look at a rough cut of Smithereens. He had a reputation for being supportive of young filmmakers, and his generosity and enthusiasm were well known within the indie film community. There's a funny thing about feedback. I was eager to hear what Jonathan had to say. He was far more experienced than I, but as we watched the rough cut together, I was also paying attention to how I felt sitting next to him. I was watching the film through his eyes, and there were times I got fidgety because the scene was paced too slowly. Times when my shoulders tensed or my face involuntarily cringed because a sequence was awkwardly edited. I could feel when Jonathan was engaged and when he was drifting. I was listening to what my gut was telling me. We talked about music, a subject he loved, and the impact the right soundtrack could have on the movie. I'd listened to Lou Reed, The Clash, The Stooges, and David Bowie on heavy rotation as I was editing the film. It put me in the right zone. So when Jonathan mentioned that he knew a musician who might be interested in working on the film score, then said it was John Cale of the Velvet Underground, I was elated. Jonathan arranged for us to meet. Unfortunately, our first meeting was weird. Cale showed up at my apartment several hours late, high and rambling in his Welsh accent. I was surprised to find out he had been a classically trained musician. Maybe he was going through a rough patch, but I'd put so much time, energy, and borrowed money into the project, I couldn't risk blowing it now. It was clear this would not be a productive working relationship as I watched him lay out lines of coke next to the editing machine, and we got straight to work on them. In all fairness, I would bump into Cale a few years later. I had no idea if he remembered me or our awkward meeting, but I was happy to see that he had pulled himself together, had a child, and had returned to producing new music. Then Jonathan told me about a band called the Feelies. They had recently recorded their first album, Crazy Rhythms, for Stiff Records. When I listened to their music, it sounded like it had been written specifically for Smithereens. The jittery guitar and restless melody line completely captured the energy of Wren. If she were music, this is what she would sound like. The Feelies' album, as already written and recorded, fit the film perfectly. For the past 2 years, I had put all my passion into making Smithereens and had little left over for a social life. Frankly, I wasn't interested. But I was about to turn 30, and that was a milestone. I was no longer a kid. I was happy I'd made a movie, but uncertain about its future. I was anxious and feeling a little melancholy. To celebrate my birthday, I went uptown to Café des Artistes for a drink with my high school friend Madeline. She, too, had left Huntington Valley for a reimagined life in New York City and lived in a small walk-up on Thompson Street. Manhattan is a cluster of small neighborhoods, each with its own distinct flavor. Downtown was my turf, and I rarely ventured above 14th Street, so going to the Upper West Side was like visiting another country. In the late 1970s, the Upper West Side was not yet gentrified and still home to many elderly Eastern European Jews. You saw them shopping for bagels and lox and lobster salad, which it turned out wasn't really made of lobster, at Zabar's, or smoked fish at Barney Greengrass. There were still old-fashioned dairy restaurants on 72nd Street where you could buy authentic blintzes and kugel. The little triangle near the 72nd Street subway station was referred to as Needle Park because of the junkies and homeless people who hung out there. In 1980, the neighborhood had few baby strollers pushed by nannies or women wearing expensive yoga attire. That would come a decade later. Café des Artistes was on West 67th Street across from Central Park. The closer you got to the park, the nicer the real estate. The restaurant, owned by a famous Hungarian chef-restaurateur, George Lang, was popular with the media crowd. Journalists and TV stars like Barbara Walters, Diane Sawyer, and Peter Jennings. It had an elegant European ambiance, soft lighting, and beautiful erotic murals of sea nymphs on the walls, painted by the artist and famous illustrator Howard Chandler Christie. Madeline and I could only afford 1 glass of wine each, which we sipped slowly so we could munch on the free quail eggs they kept in a bowl on the bar. Afterward, we headed back downtown, stopping off for a much cheaper drink at a new place, the Red Bar, that had recently opened on Avenue A. Unlike most East Village hangouts of that time, dark dives with sticky wood paneling and a mix of young punks and old Ukrainian men from the neighborhood, the Red Bar was brightly lit, with big picture windows so everyone passing by could look in. I struck up a conversation with the guy seated on the bar stool next to me. He was wearing a black leather jacket and a black beret. He told me his name was John, but somehow I started calling him Turk. I don't remember how that nickname came about. Maybe the punchline to a joke I've long since forgotten. In some ways, Turk was a kindred spirit. He had moved to Manhattan from Queens to pursue his passion for photography, but you could still hear Queens in his voice, as you could hear Philly in mine. He made a living as an assistant to a German fashion photographer named Chris von Wangenheim, whose images mixed sex and violence with edgy humor. Turk had grown up in a split-level house, not unlike the houses in my own suburban neighborhood, but more modest. If the residents of June Meadows were Jewish accountants, insurance agents, and middle management types, Turk's neighborhood was filled with Irish Catholic cops, firefighters, and union factory workers. Like me, he came from a place he wanted to escape. He was Black Irish, a term I'd never heard before that referred to the Irish descendants of the sailors who had washed ashore after the sinking of the Spanish Armada. He had green eyes and dark hair, although it was hard to tell exactly what was happening on top of his head because he was wearing that beret. He must have noticed me staring and asked, "You're wondering if I'm bald?" Then he took off his hat, and underneath was a thick mass of black curls. For a while, Turk became my constant companion, a cross between my buddy and my boyfriend. I guess you could say we were cuddle buddies. I learned he was a 30-year-old widower. He had been married to a Sicilian woman everyone called Anna Big Eyes because she had strikingly large, soulful eyes, like a character in a Margaret Keane painting. She had died in her mid-20s from sickle cell anemia. Turk was a vegetarian who occasionally ate fish, but mostly peanut butter sandwiches. He was eager to make a name for himself with his own work, so I asked him to take the subway photo that would become the poster for Smithereens. Years later, he would be the on-set photographer for Woody Allen, Brian De Palma, Terry Gilliam, and others. You'd recognize his photographs that were turned into movie posters. The haunting young DiCaprio in The Basketball Diaries, the strung-out Robert Downey Jr. in Less Than Zero. A few months ago, Turk called me to let me know he was in the hospital and dying. I was no longer living in the city, so I took the train to see him at Memorial Sloan Kettering. He had suffered from a variety of ailments over the previous decade, always seemingly on death's door, but he always pulled through. I hoped, it would be the same this time around. When I walked into his room, I was surprised to see how good he looked, with his stylish round tortoiseshell glasses and white hipster goatee. Even with a drainage tube up his nose, he didn't look like a dying man. He said he felt okay. He was on a relatively low-dose painkiller, and his mind was still sharp. That's what was so weird about the whole thing. He was so alive. But he had stopped eating over a week ago, and his body was no longer absorbing any of the nutrition from a feeding tube. The tumor that surrounded his internal organs had made digestion impossible. He asked his doctors to be straight with him, and they told him that he would probably die within a week from organ failure brought on by starvation. There was nothing more they could do other than make him comfortable and take away the pain. Turk seemed accepting of that, although still held out hope for a miracle. He asked what I was doing, and I told him I was writing a memoir and he was in it. I asked if he wanted to read the part about himself, and he did. I guess I wanted his approval. As he was reading the paragraphs above, I realized that his hair, now white, was still thick, but his curls had gone straight. I asked if he remembered why I called him Turk and why the name had stuck for all these years. Neither of us could remember how the nickname originated. He liked what I'd written and asked for one change, which I made. I asked if he was afraid. He said a little because the unknown is scary. He had been brought up Catholic but was no longer religious. We joked that when he made it to the other side, he would send me a signal. It was a sad joke, but he said he would try. As the doctors predicted, Turk died 6 days later. He was back in his apartment on 16th Street with his lovely Brazilian wife, Graça, by his side and just slipped away. It was the day before Easter Sunday. The strange thing was that the week after he died, almost every time I glanced at the clock, it was 11:11. It didn't matter, day or night, always 11:11. Turk was one of the few people who knew about my obsession with that magical number. You often remember the people who were there for you in the beginning, when your grown-up life is just starting and the world is full of possibilities. Those are the people who stick in your head 40 years later, even after they've gone. But back in 1981, Turk was a photographer's assistant, and I was an aspiring director with a lot of uncertainty about the future. Walking on Sunshine. Katrina and the Waves. Smithereens was finished, and I needed to figure out what steps to take next. I knew little about film distribution or the world of international film festivals, but I'd heard of the Cannes Film Festival because it was the most famous festival in the world. I'd seen photos of the paparazzi lining the red carpet, the glamorous European movie stars in sunglasses on the Croisette, the starlets posing topless on the beach. Somehow I'd found an address in Paris of the festival office. This was 20 years before the internet, so it wasn't easy. And on a whim, I applied, simply mailing in a handwritten postcard requesting an application. A few weeks later, I got a call from someone in New York asking me to bring my film to a screening room on 45th Street. The Cannes Selection Committee was in town and viewing submissions. I was excited and nervous, then remembered there was a big problem. Although the film was finished, I had not paid my laboratory bill, and the only existing print was locked in a storage vault at Duart Film Lab. The manager of the billing department had a policy that nothing could leave the building until it had been paid for. Fortunately, the president of Duart, Irwin Young, was a sweetheart and supportive of young filmmakers, Spike Lee and Jim Jarmusch among them. Irwin trusted me to take the print out of the lab without payment. I lugged it over to the screening room, dropped it off at a reception desk, then took the subway home to wait. A few days later, I got a call from a man with a French accent. He told me he had watched Smithereens and wanted to meet me for an early breakfast to discuss it. I remember replying, "I'm sorry, I'm not a morning person." Was I insane? And asked if we could meet later in the day. He suggested I become a morning person and said he could meet me at 8:30 a.m. And so it was arranged. We would meet in the lobby restaurant of Le Parker Meridien Hotel on West 57th Street. His name was Pierre-Henri Delot. Over breakfast, Monsieur Delot told me he was in charge of film selection for the Quinzaine de Réalisateurs, also known as the Director's Fortnight. This was the section of the Cannes Festival that showcased films by new directors, filmmakers to look out for in the future. This was where many successful directors got their start. He said he wanted to premiere Smithereens at Cannes. Huh? What? There's got to be a catch. There wasn't a catch, but there was a caveat, an expensive one. In order to screen my film, I would need to blow up the 16mm film print to 35mm because Cannes did not project films in 16mm. This would cost about $20,000. I had not even paid my lab bill. How could I afford another $20,000? He also mentioned that I would need to hire a publicist, make posters, create publicity materials, and subtitle the film in French. That could cost another $5,000 or more. Until that moment, I hadn't realized how expensive taking a film to a major festival was. There was no way I could come up with another $25,000. My family had been incredibly supportive, but I had squeezed them dry and still owed the money I'd borrowed to finish shooting the film. There was no guarantee I'd ever be able to pay them back. Then luck stepped in. I've recently heard the expression, luck is when God thinks you're cool. Did God think I was cool? I wasn't. Maybe God thought my movie was cool. Here's what I really think. Success is the collision of luck and preparation, having the right stuff at the right time. As it turned out, an English man and woman sitting at the next table had overheard our conversation. They happened to be film sales agents who had recently had success selling a small American indie film called The Return of the Secaucus 7, made by a first-time director, John Sayles. After hearing my story, they offered to advance the money needed to take Smithereens to Cannes if they could be the film's sales representatives. What they knew, and I didn't, was that if the film premiered in Cannes, they could make foreign sales deals and their advance would be covered, and then some. The movie gods had answered my prayer. I agreed to let them represent the film, and we would all go to Cannes together. The following day, I got a Western Union telegram to confirm my invitation, in case I thought it was all just a dream. Susan Seidelman, New York, New York. Utmost pleased confirm. Smithereens selected in Director's Fortnight under condition you provide 35mm French subtitled print for Cannes Festival. Letter follows and telex care o Carol Lowe, stop. Congratulations and regards. Pierre-Henri Delot, Director's Fortnight. But that's not the end of the story. A few days later, I got a call from another Frenchman named Gilles Jacob. He was the president of the entire Cannes Festival and the man who selected the films for the official competition. Those are the films that compete for the Palme d'Or, the most prestigious prize of the festival. Trust me, this was a big deal. Monsieur Jacob said he watched Smithereens and wanted to move the film out of the Director's Fortnight and put it into the official selection, where it would represent America along with two other Hollywood movies, Shoot the Moon, starring Diane Keaton and Albert Finney, and Missing, starring Sissy Spacek and Jack Lemmon. This was surreal. How could my little 16mm film with a group of unknown first-time actors compete in that spotlight? But this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so I nervously agreed. Before I left for Cannes, my new sales agents helped organize a screening in New York for 400 close friends, most of whom I didn't know, family, cast and crew members, and their guests. It was held in a once-grand Yiddish theater on 2nd Avenue and 11th Street. This was the first time I was showing the film to an audience of more than 4. As I stood on stage in a spotlight to introduce the film and thank all those involved, I remember squinting out into the audience and spotting Jan with his soon-to-be wife. I had invited him since he had invested $5,000 in the film, guilt money, but also to prove something. I wasn't sure if he would show up and wondered what was now going through his mind. I knew what was going through mine. See, I'm doing just fine without you. Go Ask Alice, Jefferson Airplane. A month later, I showed up in Cannes feeling like Alice in Wonderland. I had fallen through a rabbit hole and landed in a bizarre world of make-believe. The festival had paid for my flight and a 3-night stay at the ritzy Carlton Hotel. On my second day, I returned to the hotel and found Susan Berman, jet-lagged and asleep in the hallway in front of my door. She was clutching a large accordion. The theater producer, Joseph Papp, had generously bought her a plane ticket to France, knowing this was an experience she couldn't afford to miss. Susan had brought along the accordion because she needed to learn to play it for a show she'd soon be performing in at the public theater. We shared the hotel room like a couple of giddy teenage girls at a pajama party who couldn't believe this was actually happening. A few other cast and crew members also showed up in Cannes. We were a ragtag group compared to all the European glamour surrounding us. The whole experience was surreal, especially walking up the red carpet that led to the Palais, the large movie palace where all the big screenings took place. Midway up the theater stairs, Susan and I were directed by a publicist to stop, look out at the crowd, and freeze so the paparazzi could take photographs. I'm sure they had no idea who we were, but since we had walked the red carpet, they flashed away. Flash, flash, flash. I have a copy of one photo, and we both look stiff and slightly aloof. Privately, we were terrified and pinching ourselves to make sure this was really happening. If I could pinpoint the exact moment when I felt my life change, my aha moment, this was it. Standing at the top of the stairs, about to walk into the Palais for the world premiere of the little movie I'd struggled to make. The one I edited alone at night in my living room, in my pajamas. Now, looking around at all the paparazzi and a horde of movie fans, I remember thinking for the very first time, maybe I really am a director. In May 1982, Smithereens became the first low-budget independent American film to ever officially compete in Cannes for the festival's highest prize, the Palme d'Or. Did I feel like a pretender, a fake? Sure, a bit. But I think a little pretending is part of any transition. You need to fake it until you build up the confidence to be the real thing. Although it would take 2 more years before I could confidently write occupation film director on any official form that asked that question. Was that a female modesty thing? Personal shyness? I know several men who would have confidently filled in film director after shooting their family's home movies. My parents and sister showed up in Cannes on the day of the premiere. It must have been surreal for them as well, watching their erstwhile troublesome teenage daughter being lauded by the international press. I wanted them to be proud of me, especially my dad, but none of us were prepared for what a crazy circus Cannes would be. My father spent the next few days spotting celebrities and taking photos of topless women on the beach. I remember the press conference after the screening. The idea that journalists wanted to ask me questions and bothered to write down my answers was daunting. After my first day of interviews, I lay in the hotel bed, sleepless, thinking up much better answers than the ones I'd given, hoping I could do it again. The next time around, I'd be wittier. I got calls from agents in LA who had tracked me down at the hotel in Cannes. I was suddenly being pursued by people in Hollywood. They were sending flowers, showering me with flattery. I knew most of it was baloney, but it felt good to feel appreciated, so I took it all with a pinch of salt. Success had come quickly, but with its own set of anxieties. Would I be able to live up to expectations? Would I be a one-hit wonder? Was this just beginner's luck? Smithereens was picked up for distribution by New Line Cinema, which was, at that time, still a small New York company, founded by Robert Shea, that distributed mainly European art films and B-movie cult flicks. A few years later, New Line would have their first big commercial success with A Nightmare on Elm Street, then be acquired by Turner Broadcasting System, merge with Time Warner, and Shea would go on to produce the hugely successful Lord of the Rings trilogy. The film opened at the Waverly Theater in Greenwich Village in November 1982, 2 years before Manhattan would be cleaned up by its future mayor, Rudy Giuliani, and apartment rents would start to soar. But already the city was changing, and before long, Smithereens would look like a time capsule of a downtown world that had started to disappear. To promote the film, New Line sent me on a press tour to a few cities. It was a no-frills publicity campaign where I was put up on the living room couch or in the second bedroom of the local publicist's house. I was then schlepped around to alternative college radio stations and university campuses to do Q&As. Because I was new to this, I was willing to do whatever the publicist asked, although a few of the PR opportunities were pretty cheesy. Once I was asked to show up at the Manhattan Cable TV studio on East 23rd Street at 1 a.m. This was the very same public access studio where, 3 years earlier, porn star Robin Bird sang "Baby Let Me Bang Your Box" in her crocheted bikini. I was going to be interviewed by a man wearing a brocade 1940s-style smoking jacket who hosted a live talk show watched only by sleep-deprived weirdos. This is the kind of thing you did when you were young and eager, and you didn't want to insult your publicist because you still couldn't believe you actually had one. The studio was empty except for the host and his current guest, a cabaret singer doing a show tune medley accompanied by a pianist with a candelabra channeling the spirit of Liberace. The room had about 20 folding chairs for a non-existent studio audience. The only other guest was a young comedian who had also taken a taxi at 1 a.m. for the opportunity of doing his stand-up routine for a live audience of 4. We briefly chatted while waiting to go on. It turned out that he was a friend of my friend Joanne, both having gone to Emerson College. Now, I don't say this to name drop, just to make a point. The fact that Jay Leno, future host of The Tonight Show for 20 years, showed up at 1 a.m. to do stand-up on a public access TV show watched by a handful of insomniacs is testament to the determination you need to end up with a mansion in Beverly Hills and garages filled with Bentleys and Lamborghinis. Every opportunity is a chance to hone your craft. Everything is a learning experience. You never know who or what's around the corner. These boots are made for walking. Nancy Sinatra. The next year was an exciting time in my life. It was like my internal stereo was playing just the right song. I was feeling just the right amount of sexy, and the world around me had just the right buzz. Those times don't come often, so when they do, you remember them because secretly you know they will not last long. The culture in New York City was changing, and so was the music. It had shifted from hardcore punk to something more melodic, now referred to as new wave, and popularized by the burgeoning of MTV. These were songs you could sing and dance to. By 1983, the club scene in New York City had exploded. It seemed like every month a new dance club was opening downtown, a mix of straight and gay, black and white, rich and poor, uptown and downtown crowds. House music, a direct descendant of disco, was the sound of the night, spun by superstar DJ remixers like Larry Levan, Mark Kamens, and Anita Sarko, influenced by Bronx hip-hop DJs like Grandmaster Flash, who popularized the art of turntable scratching. Clubs such as Area, Danceteria, Paradise Garage, and the Limelight, located inside a deconsecrated Episcopal church, became hangouts for the art world and its followers, combining video, performance art, design, and fashion with throbbing dance music. A few years later, there was the Palladium, with its notorious VIP Mike Todd room, and Tunnel, a club inside a disused railroad freight terminal, with unisex bathrooms and decadently themed party rooms. Then there were the new trendy restaurants like the Odeon, which defined early 80s downtown cool when Tribeca was still a deserted neighborhood, and tiny, chic, and expensive Chanterelle on the southern tip of Soho. Suddenly, being a foodie was in. Drinking good wine, in. Reaganomics had arrived. One of my favorite watering holes was called Carumba, a large Tex-Mex restaurant on the corner of Broadway and Great Jones Street. They made a killer slushy margarita, served in a glass the size of a small fishbowl. This was long before slushy margaritas were available at TGI Fridays or Applebee's. I don't know what kind of mystery alcohol they put in the drink. It wasn't any brand of tequila I'd ever heard of and was vaguely hallucinogenic, but by the end of the night there would be bodies sprawled out on the sidewalk in front of 684 Broadway. Pedestrians would have to step around them. Even the police would drive by without a second glance. I went there once with 3 Japanese film distributors who were in town from Tokyo. They spoke very limited English and came with an interpreter, all dressed in suits and ties. The meeting started out stiffly, but after our first margarita, we spent a delightful 3 hours laughing hysterically, without understanding a word of each other's language. Something in the drink triggered a fit of giggles in even the most serious-minded person. I don't remember if the meeting resulted in a Japanese distribution deal for Smithereens, but by the end of the night, I didn't care. I just remember everyone laughing, making a lot of wild hand gestures, and one of the distributors sliding off his chair in slow motion. The restaurant closed sometime in the 1990s, and the space eventually became an overpriced tourist clothing store where you can buy Billionaire Boys Club underwear on an installment plan. 2 pairs of men's boxer briefs for only $70. But New York is ever-changing, so who knows what the building will become next. And I never did find out what they put in their mysterious margarita, but most people who hung out downtown have a funny 1980s Carumba story to tell. I spent the next year traveling to film festivals around the world. Sometimes I went alone, sometimes I went with Turk. It was a privileged, nomadic lifestyle, since the festival usually put us up in a nice hotel, gave us meal vouchers, and hosted parties with food and plenty to drink. At the time, I knew an impoverished filmmaker who was always hustling for free booze and a couch to sleep on. He was beginning to wear down the patience of his charitable friends. But he was a charming rogue who had made a very low-budget film that had gotten onto the international festival circuit. He would line up a festival-hopping schedule so he could travel from one festival directly to the next. This kept him on the road for long stretches of time where he was treated like a rock star. It also gave him a bed, meals, booze, and access to festival groupies who liked bad boy filmmakers with New York attitude. What he might have lacked in cinematic skill, he made up for with style, and in a creative universe with quixotic rules, attitude is also an art. Here's what I remember about some of the festivals I attended. In Cairo, my film never showed up. I took a beautiful boat ride down the Nile, got laryngitis from all the fine sand in the air, and went on a camel ride in the desert, and the camel driver, with whom I shared the camel, tried to hump me from behind. In Hong Kong, I was jet-lagged after a very long flight and taken to the hotel, where I fell asleep for many hours. When I woke up, I waited for someone from the hospitality office to contact me and tell me where to go and what to do. No one did. Festivals are chaotic with hundreds of foreign guests. I don't remember going to my screening and don't know if the print even arrived. In Rio, the film showed up, but the reels were projected in the wrong order, so the story made no sense. But the easygoing Brazilian audience was welcoming and enthusiastic and didn't seem to notice or care. In Cartagena, we were met at the airport and escorted onto a bus by soldiers wearing military uniforms and carrying automatic rifles. Some of them looked no older than 14. At the festival, cocaine flowed more freely than wine. The white powder was presented to guests like a welcoming goodie bag. The entire week was a blur. By the end of the year, I had accumulated a vast assortment of film festival tote bags that still come in handy today for carrying groceries at my local Stop and Shop. Despite all the traveling, I knew I needed to move on to a new project, and my LA agent was sending me scripts and arranging for meetings with studio executives. This time, I would get to meet with execs higher up on the ladder. They were always on the lookout for who or what might be the next new thing. And for a nanosecond, that was me. Californication, Red Hot Chili Peppers. Smithereens had gotten strong reviews in New York, thank you, Vincent Canby, and LA, where it was hailed as fresh and original, so I was flown out to La La Land first class by Warner Brothers and put up at the Beverly Hills Hotel. It was a very different experience than sharing a waterbed with my friend Linda. My agent set up a bunch of meet and greets, so I rented a car and drove from one studio to the next, crossing 6-lane highways, terrified. I called it the Dog and Pony Show. Producers asked me questions about what kind of project I wanted to do next. Sometimes they pitched me a project of their own. There was always a lot of excitement, enthusiasm, and then nothing. I remember one particular meeting in the office of a senior studio exec. I was escorted into the room by his attractive assistant, who brought me a bottle of expensive mineral water. The office was filled with toys, gizmos, and brightly colored playthings, as if to remind all who entered that making movies was fun. Think Pee-wee's Playhouse. Pinball machines, a barber's chair, guitars hanging on the walls along with kitschy 1950s horror movie posters. His coffee table was covered with bobbleheads and bowls of brightly colored M&Ms. The only other place I'd seen so much candy on display was my grandmother's credenza. I was given some dopey teen comedies with provisional offers to direct, pending a meeting where I was meant to discuss my creative vision for the film. My creative vision was that these scripts were mostly moronic with little redeeming value. Several were teen comedies about horny high school girls, female versions of Porky's, a film that had recently been a surprise box office hit, so studios wanted more of the same, only different. One was a script called The Joy of Sex, based on a best-selling sex manual by Alex Comfort. Paramount paid a lot of money for the rights to the book's attention-grabbing title, but struggled to turn it into a cohesive story. The film was produced a year later, directed by another female director who must have seen possibilities in the material I had missed. But she was later fired for wanting to cut out several scenes with gratuitous nudity. Making the film turned out to be a miserable experience, and she considered taking her name off the studio's re-edited version, but eventually left it on. In the end, it was no surprise that the film was a flop. As my outspoken grandmother, Nanny S., might have said, you can't put lipstick on a pig. However, the LA trip turned out to be successful. One production company offered me a development deal to supervise a screenplay based on an original idea I had pitched. It was called Ozone, about a tough girl group from Ozone Park, Queens, trying to make it in the early 1960s music business in New York. The story was inspired by the Shangri-Las, famous for both their badass attitude and their angsty songs, Leader of the Pack, Remember Walkin' in the Sand. Despite having recorded several hits, the Shangri-Las had no power over their career and never made money. At that time, the industry was controlled by powerful male producers like Phil Spector and Berry Gordy. Somehow, I was able to track down the Shangri-Las' former record producer in LA, a guy named Shadow Morton. He wore a black eye patch like a pirate. He was the man who came up with the idea to put sound effects into their songs, like the vrooming of car engines, the screeching of tires, the crunching of metal to simulate a car crash. At first, it was an attention-grabbing gimmick that worked, but by 1968, the music scene had changed, and youth culture had turned hippie and psychedelic. The Shangri-Las' sound was no longer in style. They had legal battles with their record label, and there was friction between the girls. Then, poof, they vanished. I thought that would have made an interesting movie because lots of creative women have vanished from pop culture history, and I wanted to tell that story. The executive who made the deal was an intelligent, very confident, and, at the time, very large young man named Scott Rudin. He was sharp as a razor and would eventually become just as cutting as his power within the industry spread. He was building a reputation for having good taste and the ability to get films made. Unfortunately, this script, like the majority of screenplays that are optioned, never made it beyond the developmental stage. Later, I would find out that less than 0.03% of the scripts that are developed actually get turned into movies. I knew, as a director making the transition from an indie film to a studio movie, I needed to be selective and passionate about what I did next. I'd heard a cautionary tale about another female director who had made a critically acclaimed small personal film, then directed her first studio movie with an overbearing male producer. The movie was a box office disappointment, and she wasn't heard from again for a very long time. I didn't want that to happen to me. I realized that picking the right producer was just as important as picking the right screenplay. I'd always been my own boss and feared someone breathing down my neck. I was afraid of losing touch with my intuition, which had served me well in the past. Alfred Hitchcock once said, "To make a great film, you need 3 things: the script, and the script." Then, out of the blue, my agent sent me a screenplay called Desperately Seeking Susan from an up-and-coming writer named Leora Barish. It had been well over a year since Smithereens was released, and I'd read dozens of screenplays about slutty cheerleaders, bitchy prom queens, and babysitters who get stalked by psychos in dark suburban houses. This one was different. It was also a story I felt confident I could direct. Plus, the name Susan was in the title. It was kismet. To quote the Roman philosopher Seneca, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Fortunately, I'd been preparing to make this movie ever since I was a teenager, lying in my orange bedroom with pink day-glow posters, daydreaming about living a more exciting life. Briefly, Desperately Seeking Susan was the story of Roberta Glass, a bored New Jersey housewife who lived vicariously by following a love affair carried out in the personals column of a newspaper where a young man, Jim, is desperately seeking someone named Susan. Roberta becomes intrigued by this mysterious adventuress and decides to witness Susan and Jim's rendezvous. Through a series of mix-ups, Roberta is mistaken for Susan by a gangster, and in her attempt to flee from him, she runs into a lamppost, gets conked on the head, and wakes up with amnesia. Now believing she really is Susan, Roberta is suddenly liberated to play out her own adventure. Sometimes you have to lose yourself in order to find yourself. Girls just want to have fun. Cyndi Lauper. Producer Midge Sanford was the wife of my agent's business partner. Midge had formed a production company with Sarah Pillsbury of the Pillsbury Doe family. Sarah had produced an Oscar-winning short, but neither of them had made a feature film before. As a producing team, they optioned their first script, Desperately Seeking Susan, in 1981. Apparently, the screenplay had been floating around LA for a few years before it found me. At one point, it was in development at Warner Brothers, where it languished in development hell for 2 years and was then put into turnaround. Development hell is the period of time when creative studio executives give confusing notes to improve the script, thereby stalling the process of getting it made before abandoning the project totally. The script is then put into turnaround, where it sometimes gets picked up by another studio that might make it. If not, it just disappears. This was not an easy film to get off the ground in 1984, since the 2 leading characters were women. Hollywood's thinking at that time went like this. Women like watching movies about men. Men like watching movies about men. So why not just make more movies about men and throw a little romance into the mix? I had not been the producer's first choice. They had not yet seen Smithereens and originally considered male directors like Jonathan Demme, Hal Ashby, and Louis Malle. There were so few female directors to even consider. But in retrospect, I'm confident in saying I was the right choice. The script had attracted the interest of a talented young actress named Rosanna Arquette, who was getting attention at the time. She was rumored to be the inspiration for the 1982 Toto song Rosanna. She'd dated the band's keyboard player. A few years later, in 1986, she became the inspiration for another, better song, In Her Eyes, written by then-boyfriend Peter Gabriel. Rosanna came from a family of thespians. Her parents were actors, and her grandfather, Cliff Arquette, had been a well-known comedian, performing under the name Charlie Weaver. I remember watching him as a regular on the TV show Hollywood Squares. Years later, Rosanna's sister, Patricia, would win Oscar, Emmy, and Golden Globe awards, and her brother, David, would have a successful career buoyed by the slasher horror franchise Scream, then marry and divorce his co-star, Courtney Cox. Gender-fluid sibling Alexis Arquette would sadly die from complications due to HIV at age 47. I'm told that when Rosanna first read the screenplay for Desperately Seeking Susan, she thought she was being asked to play the role of the free-spirited bohemian Susan, not the unhappy suburban housewife Roberta Glass. I flew out to LA to meet with Midge, Sarah, and the writer, Leora. The producers were still pitching the script around town, but felt it needed a rewrite. I had some ideas about how to give it a spin. Leora's screenplay was a playful story that I could bring my own bag of tricks to. It reminded me of a French movie I'd seen in the late 70s called Celine and Julie Go Boating by Jacques Rivette. When I mentioned this to Leora, she said she loved that film too and had been inspired by it. Both stories involved transformation, reinvention, and had a sprinkling of magic. What I also loved was that Leora's script had a bad girl and a good girl, but the good girl was a little bit bad, and the bad girl was beguiling. Instinctively, I knew this was the script I'd been waiting for. I'd always been fascinated by stories where people get to exchange identities and live vicariously in another person's shoes. I remember as a kid watching Disney's 1961 The Parent Trap, where identical twins, separated as babies, meet at a summer camp and decide to switch places. Both are played by the talented young actress Hayley Mills. Why this theme excited me had little to do with the comedic possibilities of mistaken identity confusion or the farce inherent in near-miss situations. It had to do with the excitement of becoming someone different. Hiding behind a false identity, desperate housewife Roberta Glass gets to reveal something truthful about herself. Many women have another woman living inside them, the cool and confident one we love to present to the world, the one who can dance all night without breaking a sweat, charm her way out of a speeding ticket, and tell a good raunchy party joke. As opposed to the self-doubting and insecure one who goes to sleep with us at night and haunts our dreams, the one we want to smother with a pillow. Desperately Seeking Susan was also a love story between two women, minus the sex. Roberta becomes obsessed with her more glamorous double, and in the process, Susan becomes curious about Roberta. The women's relationships with the men in the film are secondary. As a kid, I'd read Alice in Wonderland, the tale of the bored young girl who follows a mysterious creature down a rabbit hole and into another world. Roberta, the wistful housewife, would be Alice. Susan would be the white rabbit, and I would turn downtown Manhattan into Wonderland, where anything was possible. The relationship between a director and a screenwriter can be tricky. The writer conceives of the original idea and writes the script, but then it gets handed over to a director who must make it their own. This is not about ego, although that's sometimes a factor. This mysterious conversion from words on paper to images on screen is what gives a film life and personality, a point of view. A script is a blueprint for a story the director rewrites on film, and my favorite movies have always been the ones where the director let me peek inside their head. When a director doesn't succeed in doing that, a movie can feel generic or inert. Although one could also argue that many a good screenplay has been ruined by the self-indulgence or ineptitude of its director. The script went through a series of revisions over the next few months. The biggest change involved the character of Susan. In the original 1979 draft, Susan was a nomadic hippie, a role that might have been played by Diane Keaton or Goldie Hawn wearing a backpack. At one point, a studio executive even suggested Barbra Streisand. But after making Smithereens, I wanted to set Desperately Seeking Susan firmly in the world of the Lower East Side. The character of Susan would be a more charismatic and carefree version of Wren. Both were drifters, moochers, and manipulators, but Susan made it look effortless and fun. Finding the right tone for the film would be my biggest creative challenge. I wanted the characters to be real and recognizable, but the atmosphere to feel enchanted. The vulnerability of Roberta needed to balance the cool of Susan. Orion Pictures, a mini-major studio at that time, was interested in making the movie, pending the casting of the two lead roles. Producers Midge and Sarah had been incredibly tenacious, enlisting the support of an Orion executive named Barbara Boyle, an outspoken 1970s feminist who wore knee-high boots. Barbara was the senior vice president of production, working directly under President Mike Medavoy. I liked Medavoy, although it was rumored he didn't read scripts. He had been a successful LA agent, repping talent like the young Steven Spielberg and Francis Ford Coppola, before joining United Artists, then becoming one of the co-founders of Orion. Boyle pushed for the film even when other Orion executives doubted her. She was a fan of Smithereens and loved that Desperately Seeking Susan had women producers, a woman writer, 2 female leads, and could be made for under $5 million on location in New York. Our budget was $4.5 million. Orion Pictures turned out to be the perfect home. Their corporate office was in New York, and they had a reputation for being director-friendly and hands-off. Woody Allen, Jonathan Demme, James Cameron, and Oliver Stone had made films there. Orion basically left you alone once the key cast and budget were approved. Even though I'd never directed a studio movie before, I felt confident that I had a clear vision for the film, a supportive studio, and trusted collaborators. Before we started production, I remember driving around LA with Barbara Boyle in her Jaguar. She was giving me a tour of the town. We drove past the exclusive Hotel Bel Air, the huge mansions on Sunset, the celebrity homes on Beverly Drive and Carrollwood. We were taking a scenic route to her house in the Pacific Palisades, and I was gawking at the view out the car window when she turned and said something like, "This could be your future." And I remember thinking, wow, could this really be my future? Followed by sudden panic, is this the future I want? I confess, something about the deserted streets of Beverly Hills reminded me of a far more glamorous version of the homogeneous suburb I'd escaped, but with bigger mansions and more exotic vegetation. Yet I was flattered to hear her say that this was a future possibility, albeit an unlikely one. Then I remembered that LA is car culture and I hated to drive. Here's one reason why. In 1969, my senior year of high school, a college boy from Philadelphia invited me on a date to Manhattan. I'd only visited the city twice before, with my parents to see a Broadway show and eat at an Italian tourist trap called Mama Leone's. But for a young girl from the burbs, NYC seemed magical. So even though I barely knew this boy and we had little in common, going on a grown-up dinner date to the city that never sleeps was an adventure I couldn't miss out on. We went to a fancy-schmancy restaurant called the Four Seasons, and for a few hours I felt very sophisticated. But we still found little to talk about, so I spent most of the evening gazing wide-eyed around the elegant dining room at the beautifully dressed people, pretending this was my normal life. I had read about the Playboy Club on East 59th Street, so after dinner I suggested we try to get in. At the door I was immediately carded, and since I was only 17 and looked 15, I never made it past the bouncer. We then headed home. The boy tried to kiss me on the walk back to the parking lot, but I wasn't feeling it. So I told him he'd probably had too much to drink and should sleep it off in the back seat. I then got behind the wheel of his father's huge Lincoln Continental, a car the size of a boat, and drove all the way back to Philly on the New Jersey Turnpike. I did a pretty good job, too, considering I was an inexperienced driver, having just gotten my license 6 months earlier and could barely see over the steering wheel. I made it safely to the toll booth in Willow Grove and paid the toll, but as I drove away, I misjudged a curve in the road, impaling the front end of the Lincoln on a guardrail. The boy in the back seat woke up with a start. Reluctantly, he called his father from the toll booth phone to tell him the news. I called mine. We then sat in silence for the next hour in the disabled vehicle, waiting for our parents to show up. Neither father was happy when they arrived at 2 a.m. and took us home in separate cars. That was my first and last date with the boy. The night had ended with a bang and another strike against me in my father's book. 4 years later, I would move to Manhattan, where thankfully I didn't need to drive. One man's ceiling is another man's floor. Paul Simon. Once I signed the contract to direct Desperately Seeking Susan, I was able to leave my lonely Wall Street apartment and move to Soho. I got a loft on Thompson Street between Houston and Prince. It had high ceilings, brick walls, and rustic wooden support columns. It would be the building where Jonathan, my partner, who I hadn't met yet, and our son, Oscar, who hadn't been born, would live with me for the next 35 years. In the 19th century, it had been a factory building that manufactured banners and flags. In the 1970s, Soho was still a marginal neighborhood filled with workshops, small manufacturers, and printing plants alongside 4-story tenement walk-ups, mostly lived in by Italian families. In 1978, the building was converted into one of the first loft co-ops in Soho. Half of the building was designated AIR, living spaces specifically allocated for artists in residence, back when New York City actually did benevolent stuff like that. By 1983, when I moved in, the neighborhood had started to change, but still retained a funky, down-to-earth feel. It was not yet a Manhattan neighborhood frequented by tour buses. There were no flagship designer stores on West Broadway, no Gucci, no Prada, no downtown megastores on Lower Broadway. Those would come a decade later. The west side of Soho was Italian. The area used to be called the South Village, until real estate developers and brokers realized they could charge much higher rents if they just called it Soho. Middle-aged wise guys from the Genovese crime family sat on folding chairs, drinking coffee and smoking cigars in front of small social clubs on Thompson and Sullivan Streets. They watched over the neighborhood like hawks and knew everyone who lived there and everyone who didn't. As a woman living alone, I felt personally protected by the mob. The corner grocery store was owned by an Italian family before the Koreans took it over in the early 90s. I'd seen Vincent the Chin Gigante, boss of the Genovese crime family, wandering down Bleecker Street in his bathrobe and pajamas, mumbling to himself like he had dementia, a ploy he supposedly used to avoid jail time for murder. His mother had a modest apartment nearby. Graffiti art was starting to pop up on the sides of buildings, and looking down, you could see the word SAMO, short for same old shit, painted on the sidewalk. It was the tag of Jean-Michel Basquiat, still unknown. There were also the unmistakable outlines of the radiant babies, barking dogs, and dancing men that would make Keith Haring famous. The neighborhood felt like a small village. Pino's Butcher Shop and Joe's Dairy were on Sullivan Street, Raffetto's Pasta on Houston. There was the guy who ran the postbox store on the corner of McDougal who cut keys, sold a few religious tchotchkes, and was a notary public. He had an outdated assortment of holiday greeting cards that were never sold. Everyone assumed he was connected. No one asked. Down the street, there was the mysterious gun club with a shooting range in the basement and a private dining room for big shots from North Jersey and Staten Island. The center of this world was St. Anthony's Church. My living room windows faced the church directly across the street. Once a year, the church had a confirmation ceremony where 12 and 13-year-olds dressed in white marched down the street carrying flowers alongside floats with statues of saints. Everyone on Thompson Street hung out their windows to watch. I had a front row seat without leaving home. In the summer was the Feast of St. Anthony, where the street was closed to traffic and the curb was lined with Zeppoli, calzone, and Italian sausage trucks, along with carnival games where you could win gigantic stuffed animals and goldfish in baggies. If you got in good with the priests, they made sure you never got a parking ticket. I would become friendly with several of the food truck vendors 5 years later when they became background actors in my mob comedy, Cookie. There was a small neighborhood playground on Thompson Street with a couple of rusty swing sets, a sandbox, and a small outdoor swimming pool that was open to the public in the summer. When my son, Oscar, was a toddler, this was where I'd sometimes take him to play, but we never set foot in the pool, not trusting what might be in the water. After the day Oscar picked up a used condom next to the sliding board, we switched our playdates to nearby Washington Square Park. The superintendent of my building was a Californian who had come to New York City to be an opera singer. Everyone comes to New York with a dream. He ran the building with Svengali-like control, and you could hear his booming baritone vibrating through the elevator shaft every afternoon as he practiced arias. The lobby had a scrawny rubber plant that someone had discarded, which now sat next to the mailboxes. No one had the heart to throw it out. The old radiators clanged. The door buzzer only worked until midnight, after which time you needed to personally go downstairs to open the door for your guests. There was a fake security camera hanging from the ceiling in the lobby intended as a visual deterrent, but at the time the camera wasn't connected to an actual video security system. If Jonathan or Oscar were locked out late at night, I'd throw the front door keys out our living room window, balled up in a sock, onto the sidewalk below. That was life on Thompson Street, and I loved it. Even decades later, when the neighborhood had been gentrified beyond recognition, our Thompson Street building never put in a gym or a rooftop garden like so many of the new Soho condos now had. But its down-to-earth facade has been home to Daniel Day-Lewis and his wife, filmmaker Rebecca Miller, a hideaway for a young Rockefeller, the residence of two well-known New York Times investigative reporters, one with a disability callously mocked by then-President Trump, and crib to the kid who started Rockstar Games and made a fortune from Grand Theft Auto. Many of the building's original outliers have since moved away. Like much of Soho, the building is now mostly home to lawyers, investment bankers, and money managers. Ain't nothing like the real thing. Marvin Gaye. In the spring of 1984, when Desperately Seeking Susan was greenlit, there was only one actor attached, Rosanna Arquette, who had been brought on board by the producers. To put together the rest of the cast, we hired two young casting directors, Risa Brayman and Billy Hopkins, whose experience up until that point had been casting for the Ensemble Studio Theater. This would be their first job working on a movie. Everyone's concern was to find the right actor for the role of Susan. We considered every young actress who was generating excitement in the early 1980s. Ellen Barkin, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Jamie Lee Curtis, Linda Fiorentino, Kim Cattrall, Kelly McGillis, Melanie Griffith. Even singer Suzanne Vega came in to audition. But I knew of another singer who happened to live only a few blocks away in a loft on Broome Street and thought she might be an interesting possibility. I remember the first time Madonna caught my eye. It was still the early days of cable TV, and MTV, launched in 1981, was playing a music video for a newly released single called Borderline. There weren't many music videos back then, so the early ones were played on heavy rotation. The singer had messy blonde hair held back with a big floppy headband and wore a cut-off denim jean jacket. She came across as self-assured and cheeky. She knew how to flirt with the camera. I'd heard that Madonna was interested in a movie career and had done a small singing cameo in the film Vision Quest. I thought she might give the role of Susan, the downtown grifter, some authentic street cred, so I asked the casting directors to arrange for her to come in to audition. The day of our meeting, Madonna arrived at the production office by taxi. Somehow, she'd managed to get the driver to wait by the curb while she disappeared inside the building in the hope of finding money to pay for the ride. Cynical New York cab drivers don't usually wait while a passenger disappears, so already that was proof of her persuasiveness. I think she borrowed money from an assistant sitting behind the reception desk. I don't know if the assistant ever got paid back, but I remember thinking to myself, here's this girl coming in to audition for a job, and she actually hit us up for cab fare. That's something Susan would have done. It immediately grabbed my interest. Later on, Madonna would admit to sharing a lot with the character of Susan. The role was not so far removed from the persona she'd adopted throughout the 1980s. Both Madonna and Susan used their powers of persuasion to get friends and lovers to do what they wanted. Both were charming con artists who didn't let you know you were being conned. There was an art to seduction, and Madonna had mastered it. She was a flirt who made everyone she flirted with feel a little bit sexier. Orion had to approve the casting of the lead actresses, and because Madonna was a newcomer, that involved jumping through some hoops. So, Madonna flew out to Los Angeles to meet with the Orion executives. Barbara Boyle had never heard of her, but had a 15-year-old son, David, who had. Apparently, he was an early Madonna fan and told his mother that she had to hire Madonna immediately. The following day, Madonna walked into Barbara's office, fell on her knees, and said, "I'll do anything to get this part." Barbara responded, "Sorry, I'm heterosexual." And Madonna replied, "How do you know unless you try?" Instantly, Barbara knew Madonna had the sass to play the role and told her to take a seat. According to Barbara, they had the following conversation. "Barbara, I understand you're a successful singer and performer. Why do you want to be an actress?" Madonna, "You understand from whom?" Barbara, "My son, David." Madonna then took a pencil and paper off Barbara's desk and wrote a note. "Dear David, tell your mother to give me this role." And it worked. Barbara spoke to Mike Medavoy, who agreed to pay for a screen test when Madonna returned to New York. The following week, the cinematographer, Ed Lackman, Madonna, a small crew of 4, and I went to a nearby park to film the test. I remember while we were filming, a few passers-by glanced in our direction, but paid little attention. Small crews of NYU students were often filming in the park. But I recall one teenage girl calling out, "Look, there's Cyndi Lauper." Fortunately, the test went well, and Madonna was hired. Allowing me to cast a relatively unknown singer was a risk for Orion, but the risk would pay off in spades. Of course, no one could have predicted Madonna's meteoric rise to stardom only 3 months later. The proof was reflected in her acting fee, about 1/3 of Rosanna's. The best thing about working with someone who isn't yet a star is that there are no agents, managers, personal assistants, or an entourage of sycophants hanging around the set. No personal hair and makeup people hovering near the video monitor and making suggestions. To prepare, Madonna and I talked about screwball comedies of the 1930s and 40s. Those comedies had strong and feisty heroines: Judy Holliday in Born Yesterday, Barbara Stanwyck in The Lady Eve, Carole Lombard in My Man Godfrey, and Rosalind Russell in almost everything she did. They were bodacious women, often outsmarting their male counterparts. Screwball comedy gave actresses roles to shine in, ones much more exciting than the traditional housewife and devoted girlfriend roles usually available to actresses at that time. Now that we had our 2 female leads, we needed to pull together the rest of the cast. Billy and Risa knew all the best up-and-coming theater actors and brought them in to audition. For many, this would be their first time in a feature film. John Turturro, Will Patton, Laurie Metcalf, Mark Blum, Anna Levine Thompson, Giancarlo Esposito, and poker-faced comedian Stephen Wright would all go on to long and successful careers. I also cast some musicians and performers, like Ann Magnuson, Richard Hell, Richard Edson, Annie Carlisle, Ardo Lindsay, Annie Golden, John Lurie, and Rocket's Red Glare in small cameos. They would add the downtown credibility I was looking for. In a strange twist of fate, Rocket's Red Glare, the sometimes actor, sometimes drug dealer, and bodyguard to Sid Vicious, was supposedly present the night Nancy Spungen was killed in the Chelsea Hotel. I didn't know this when I cast him in the role of Madonna's chatty taxi driver, who improvised one of the film's memorable lines. "Sushi, I hate this stuff. Although I had some the other day. I took it home, cooked it. It wasn't bad. It tasted like fish." Mark Blum was quickly cast in the role of Rosanna's suburban, hot-tub-selling husband, Gary Glass. Mark had the clean-cut good looks of a leading man, but instinctively knew how to play a comedic foil without turning the character into a cartoon, bringing the perfect degree of self-deprecating humor to the role. He and actress Laurie Metcalf, playing his neurotic sister Leslie, had great comedic timing, and Laurie delivered one of the more memorable lines in the film. "Just take a Valium like a normal person." For the lead role of Des, we hoped to cast a male star opposite Rosanna. The producers and I discussed Kevin Costner and Dennis Quaid, who had both recently made successful films, but it was hard to find a young leading man who wanted to play third fiddle to 2 leading ladies. Then we discovered Aidan Quinn. Aidan had recently starred in a movie called Reckless, opposite Daryl Hannah, playing a motorbike-riding high school rebel. He was a serious actor, with an understated cool attitude and brooding good looks. Reckless had failed at the box office, which now made Aidan available. That's the way it worked in Hollywood. There was a definite hierarchy. We sent Aidan's agents the script, and they expressed interest. During our first meeting, I remember thinking Aidan was very handsome, but worried he might be too somber for the role. This was a comedy. It needed to stay buoyant. Then I realized that there were already so many quirky, colorful characters in the film, there needed to be someone to ground the story, to keep it from getting too zany. Aidan gave the role the right amount of edge and earthy bemusement to contrast with Rosanna's slightly dizzy amnesiac. There was another lead role that needed to be cast, the part of Madonna's punk musician boyfriend, Jim. We held auditions where Madonna read against the top contenders to see how their chemistry would work. Some of the auditions got pretty steamy. There was a dialogue scene that called for a kiss at the end, and the next thing I knew, the actors were down on the floor making out. The casting directors and I watched with dropped jaws. It was certainly attention-grabbing, and some of the actors left the casting office blushing, but with a juicy story to tell their grandchildren one day. An unknown actor-bartender named Bruce Willis was one of the finalists and gave a great performance, but ultimately the role went to Robert Joy. Bruce would turn up again, working as the bartender at our wrap party on the last night of shooting, as cheerful and irreverent as ever. 2 years later, I would bump into him at a restaurant in L.A. where he thanked me. For what? I asked. He said that because he didn't get the part in Desperately Seeking Susan, he had moved to L.A. to try his luck out there and was quickly cast in a TV series called Moonlighting. The show turned out to be a huge hit, which led to several action hero movie roles and mega stardom. Sadly, 38 years later, at the age of 67, Bruce would be diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, ending his long and celebrated career. To helm a studio picture, I love that word, helm, so variety speak, I needed to join the Directors Guild. In order to do so, you had to be recommended by 3 current guild members. My Directors Guild of America application was signed by Woody Allen. This was the early 1980s, before his reputation was clouded by sexual abuse allegations and a dramatic fall from grace, Mike Nichols, and Martin Scorsese. These were the 3 best directors working in New York, along with Sidney Lumet, although I'd never actually met any of them in person at that time. But they had either liked Smithereens or just wanted to be supportive of a young woman director, given there were so few. Years later, I would have dinner with Mike Nichols at a restaurant uptown. I went there with Nora Ephron while we were working together on Cookie. Penny Marshall was also at the table. Both women would go on to very successful directing careers. But Nora hadn't directed a movie yet and was just starting the screenplay for When Harry Met Sally, and Penny was still editing Big and had no idea it would be an enormous hit. A few years later, Penny would direct A League of Their Own, making her the first woman to direct 2 films that each grossed over $100 million at the box office. Mike Nichols was the epitome of charm, wit, and sophistication. His conversation was peppered with just the right amount of self-deprecating humor and irony. Plus, he'd made 3 of my favorite movies, The Graduate, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and Carnal Knowledge, and would go on to make the wonderful Working Girl. That night he gave me some excellent advice. Be able to identify a good idea, no matter where it comes from, then claim it as your own, he said, and gave a mischievous grin. I'd met Ed Lachman at the Telluride Film Festival the year before, and we hit it off on the dance floor. He'd been the director of photography on a few small German films with directors I respected, Werner Herzog and Wim Wenders. He had a painter's eye and wanted to paint with light. We were dancing together at a party when Herzog came over and told me I danced like a Negro. At that time, he spoke stilted English. I think that was a compliment, and that's certainly how I took it. Executive producer Michael Pizer introduced me to Santo Loquasto, who had previously worked with Woody Allen as a costume designer. Since Ours was a low-budget studio movie, Pizer wisely hired Santo as both the costume and production designer. This saved the production money and had the benefit of assuring that the costumes and sets would have a unified vision. Ed, Santo, and I had long conversations about color palette, lighting design, camera movement, costumes, and props. We thought about the various ways we could create 2 very different and distinct worlds, one for each of the 2 main characters. We looked through fashion magazines, photography books, and pop culture references. Roberta, the dreamy housewife, would live in a contemporary suburban house that had soft lighting and was furnished in neutral pastel colors. She would dress in beige. Her life was beige. Susan's world would be sharp, gritty, and vibrant. We would create a hyper-realistic version of the bohemian Lower East Side using boldly colored gels on the deserted streets and alleyways to give the city an enchanted glow, a combination of grit and glamour. Ed's lighting style would become popular, then overused, in MTV videos for the next decade. We talked about magic and symbols and the importance of the pyramid jacket that Roberta and Susan would exchange during the film. It was a short tuxedo-style black and gold jacket designed by Santo that would be adorned on the back with a pyramid and the Eye of Providence, the all-seeing eye, surrounded by rays of light. It represented divine providence, exotic adventure, and also money. It's the symbol on the flip side of a dollar bill. Years later, I learned that Madonna didn't like the jacket when she first saw it, which is ironic since it would become linked to her 80s persona for decades to come. There's an expression, God is in the details. Details may seem small and insignificant, but they can speak volumes about character and atmosphere. I was happy to be working with collaborators who understood the power the right details could have. Hit me with your best shot. Pat Benatar. The first day at the production office, I should have worn something different. Having seen photos of legendary directors like Alfred Hitchcock, Howard Hawks, and Vincent Minnelli wearing suits and ties on set, I wanted to dress for work. There was, and still is, a typical male film director uniform: a baseball cap, jeans, sneakers, and a crew jacket with the name of a previously successful film production embroidered on it. Oh, and a beard. I wasn't trying to be one of the guys, so I decided to wear a skirt. I rarely wore skirts and only owned two. One had a flouncy flamenco style that might have looked good on a beach in Ibiza, but was out of place in a no-frills production office with gray metal rental furniture. In retrospect, I think I wanted to set a girls just want to have fun atmosphere. That day, like most pre-production days, was long. Every department had questions, and the director needed to answer them all. If you're not good at multitasking, directing is not the right job for you. At the end of the day, I happened to walk past Santo's office. He smiled, then followed me down the hall and gently tugged on the back of my skirt. Then he whispered, "Your underpants are showing." "My underpants are what?" It turned out I had accidentally tucked the back of my flouncy skirt into my underwear when I used the bathroom. I don't remember what underwear I was wearing, but I hope it wasn't my cotton ones with the days of the week printed across the backside, because it would probably have been the wrong day. I must have been walking around like that for a while, without anyone mentioning it. Maybe they secretly enjoyed seeing the director's panties. Maybe they thought calling it to my attention would embarrass me. But I'd like to think they were so engaged in their own creative tasks that no one even noticed. Of course, this was one of those small, mortifying moments that others won't remember, but has replayed in my head for years. Eventually, I would come to realize that making a movie is like walking a tightrope. You put one foot steadily in front of the other and just keep walking. Never look down. Although something happened that almost made me stumble. 2 weeks before we were about to start filming, I found out I was pregnant. I now remember this as if it were a movie scene. Here's the screenplay. Exterior, hot tub, mountain town. Night, 1 year earlier. A group of happy, slightly inebriated filmmakers relax in a large hot tub in a storybook western town where a film festival is taking place. Steam rises from the surface of the tub, enveloping the group in mist. Majestic mountains, silhouetted by the moon, are seen in the background. A petite, dark-haired film director, let's call her Susan, catches the eye of an attractive documentary filmmaker soaking nearby. He paddles over to her. They flirt, chat about all the movies they've watched that day, joke about having butt-ache from sitting for so long, exchange phone numbers, nothing more. The festival will end tomorrow, and they will both return to their respective coasts. Cut 2, interior, Soho Bar, night, several months later. The documentary filmmaker is visiting New York City. He calls Susan and they meet for a drink, maybe 2, possibly 3, at a cozy neighborhood bar. More movie talk about upcoming projects, more laughter, more flirting. Cut 2, interior, loft bedroom, later that night. Susan and the documentary filmmaker are in bed, having just had sex. Close up on Susan's face, she looks worried. If we could read her mind, we'd know it's concern about a broken condom. She reaches down to touch her inner thigh. It's wet, sticky. Interior, bathroom, night, 1 month later. Close on, an early pregnancy test kit, the overly complicated kind they made back in 1984. Susan sits on the toilet seat, pours droplets from a chemical solution into a vial, and mixes it with urine. It looks like a science experiment from high school. There are several steps involved and a 20-minute wait. Dissolve 2. The solution in the vial has changed color. The camera pushes in tight on Susan's face, distressed. Dramatic music swells as the screen slowly fades to black. No matter how many times I've replayed this movie in my head, the fact remained the same. I was pregnant, and the timing couldn't have been worse. My professional career was just beginning. At 32, I'd been given a rare opportunity to direct a studio movie. I needed to be at the top of my game physically, mentally, emotionally. On the other hand, I wanted to have a child one day and was no longer young. But being pregnant was not an option I could consider. It wasn't the right time or the right partner. So I made a decision that was right for me. I did not take this casually. I would have preferred to keep the whole thing private, but felt obligated to tell my producers. I can only imagine what went through their minds. It was a Friday, 2 weeks before we were about to start filming. I've debated about editing this event out of my memoir. I've taken it out, put it back in, out, in, out. But finally, I left it in to make a point. I've often wondered how this situation might have played out if my producers weren't women, or were less understanding, or if the choice I made had not been a legal option at the time. The following Monday, I was back in the production office, and 2 weeks later, on schedule, we began shooting on St. Mark's Place on the Lower East Side. I did not wear a flouncy skirt. Instead, I wore jeans, a t-shirt, and a jacket with lots of pockets for all my director stuff. Viewfinder, shot lists, headphones, lipstick. Nor did I wear a baseball cap or grow a scruffy beard. I did, however, wear a jaunty pork pie hat. As I watched the camera trucks unloading, the crew setting up for the first shot, and Madonna heading into the hair and makeup trailer, I turned to Midge and Sarah and said, I guess we can now crack open that bottle of champagne. It had been a long haul, and we had never been fully confident that the film was actually going to get made. Even during pre-production, we were waiting for a curtain to drop, saying, just kidding, everyone go home. But the camera was now rolling, and I watched as Madonna, playing Susan, walked down the street wearing little white gloves and munching on cheese doodles. Some pedestrians stopped to watch, but few paid much attention. New Yorkers are cool and hard to impress. We were just another film crew on the streets of Manhattan. Madonna was not yet famous, so there were no movie stars to gawk at. That evening, Midge, Sarah, and I finally popped the cork and made a toast. 10 shots down, 535 more to go. Big girls don't cry. Fergie. First impressions are powerful, so the way you introduce a main character into a story is extremely important. When someone enters a room, just like when they enter a movie scene, you get an instant sense of who they are. You're immediately engaged or not. I knew I needed to find the right opening image and set a tone to quickly define each leading lady and establish the different worlds they lived in. Roberta is introduced in the soft, feminized world of a hair salon, a place for transformation. People go there to be changed, made over, renewed in some way, and Roberta was a woman desperate for reinvention. We first see her being fussed over by her overbearing sister-in-law, Leslie, who knows exactly what Roberta needs to be happy. A better haircut. But what Roberta really needs is passion and adventure. She's a romantic at heart. In contrast to Roberta's wistful daydreaming, we meet Susan sprawled out on the floor of a garish hotel room in Atlantic City. She's dressed in black fishnets and a tuxedo-style jacket with a gold pyramid emblazoned on the back. Discarded room service trays, poker chips, and playing cards are scattered on the floor around her, and she's taking selfies with a Polaroid camera. Who knew 2 decades later everyone would be taking selfies? There's a man asleep in a bed behind her, but Susan looks bored, restless. We will later find out he's a gangster with whom she had a short fling. Instantly, the film sets up that Susan is naughty, adventurous, and narcissistic. Someone who lives life by her own rules. The introduction of the 2 main characters establishes their differences, but also their similarities. Both are scanning the personal ads in a newspaper. Both are desperately seeking something. This would be Madonna's first film role, and our relationship was relatively straightforward and stress-free. I liked the little details she brought to the role. One of my favorite moments took place in the bathroom at the Port Authority bus terminal. It was scripted that after arriving on a bus from Atlantic City, Susan goes into the restroom to change her clothes and wash up. While filming, Madonna suddenly flipped the nozzle on a wall-mounted air blower and used it to dry her armpits, turning this improvisation into a memorable movie moment, and years later, a popular internet gif. My relationship with Rosanna was more complicated. There was an undercurrent of defensiveness on both our parts. This was the first time I was working with a young Hollywood star who was probably used to more stroking than I was giving. Her on-screen fragility and vulnerability were what made her past performances so moving, and she'd just come off the set of the latest Martin Scorsese film, After Hours. He was far more experienced than I at knowing how to make his actors feel special and secure. Also, he was an older man, 17 years Rosanna's senior. I say that because, in retrospect, I think gender and age were a factor. Young women directing young women was still a relatively new thing, and I would later come to realize that the job involved a lot of cajoling and ego massaging to get performers to do what you wanted or needed them to do. I had come from the rough-and-tumble world of low-budget New York indie filmmaking. During Smithereens, the actors were newcomers. We were all in the trenches together. There was no power hierarchy, no schmoozing. I was unskilled at hiding my feelings. I'm sure that whatever was on my mind was written across my forehead. Unfortunately, once tension between an actor and director sets in, every creative decision, every suggestion is viewed with mistrust and suspicion. That mistrust goes both ways, and when that cycle begins, it's like walking on eggshells. The simplest feedback can become a defensive argument. That's something they don't teach you in film school. It's not always easy to communicate with actors, which is why so many young filmmakers focus on the technical aspects of movie making. Those are the things you can control: the camera, lighting, production design, and editing. Dealing with creative people with egos and insecurities, as well as your own self-doubt, is a tricky maneuver that involves subtle negotiation and intuition. It's also about trust. I had a clear vision of how I wanted the film to look and feel, but hadn't yet earned Rosanna's trust. On top of that, she had signed on to star in a movie with a relatively unknown co-star when midway through production that dynamic totally changed. Madonna started to get a massive amount of attention, and the press began referring to the film as the Madonna movie. In retrospect, I probably wasn't sensitive enough to how Rosanna might have felt. I still had a lot to learn. Then came the day I cried on set, in public. It's unusual for me to cry in public. I'm not a crybaby and have a pretty high anxiety threshold. It would be the only time in my nearly 35 years as a director that would happen. Stop it. Control yourself. Directors don't cry, I said to myself, pressing a fingernail sharply into the palm of my hand as a distraction. Then came that choked-up feeling I get in the back of my throat when I'm angry or upset, and I felt my eyes begin to tear. I don't know what triggered this sudden flood of emotion. Anxiety? Exhaustion? Frustration that I didn't know how to communicate with Rosanna? It was the day we were filming a scene in the Port Authority bus terminal, where Roberta finds a key to a locker in the pocket of her pyramid jacket. If you've seen the movie, you'll remember the scene. Roberta, suffering from amnesia, goes with Des, Aidan Quinn, to the bus terminal to find out what's inside the mysterious locker. What started the clash was a conversation Rosanna and I were having about amnesia. In real life, a person with amnesia might be terrified and totally disoriented. Amnesia is scary. But this was a comedy, so it needed to be played realistically enough to convey memory loss, but without destroying the lighthearted tone of the film. What began as a private conversation quickly escalated into a public argument in front of 40 crew members and 100 extras standing around watching. Thankfully, this was a decade before the internet. No one had a cell phone or could post a photo online. Maybe if I'd been more experienced, I'd have understood her method and been more helpful. Certainly, we should have found a private place to talk. I was stressed. So was she. The assistant director was pointing to his watch and flashing me a cringy, let's get moving face. The crew and all the extras were waiting in place to shoot, and here Rosanna and I were, sitting on the floor of the bus station, stuck in an emotional loop. Midge and Sarah were on set that day and eventually joined in the conversation. Pretty soon we were all in tears. Midge later said, "There should be more crying on movie sets. It's the female version of yelling." Long hours and a pressurized schedule can cause tensions to flare, but it was also because we all cared. We had worked so hard to get the film made and wanted to get everything right. Besides, crying isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that shows you don't give a shit if your nose is running and your eye makeup is smeared down your cheeks, making you look like a rabid raccoon. I wonder, do male directors and actors ever cry together on set? Maybe they just punch the crap out of each other. Eventually, emotions cooled. We all took a deep breath and got on with our work. But sometimes the most exhausting moments on set are the ones that turn out best on film. There were fortunate surprises, too. Like the day we were filming on 25th Street and walking down the sidewalk just by happenstance were 3 identical-looking young men dressed in identical clothing. Since Desperately Seeking Susan was a movie about mistaken identity and doubles, it seemed auspicious that triplets should suddenly wander onto our movie set. I asked if they would mind standing in the doorway of the building where we were about to start filming and smile at Madonna as she walked past them in white fishnets and a garter belt. They readily agreed. I knew nothing about the triplets' lives or past history, which turned out to be fascinating, but ultimately sad. 25 years later, they would be the subject of a documentary called 3 Identical Strangers, the story of triplets adopted at birth by 3 different families and unaware of each other's existence until they were 20. Unwittingly, they had been part of a secret scientific experiment that studied the development of genetically identical siblings who were intentionally raised in different socioeconomic circumstances. Nature versus nurture. They had been used as human guinea pigs. It took a little over 9 weeks to shoot Desperately Seeking Susan. One of our final filming locations was the Magic Club, the set we created inside the Audubon Ballroom on 165th Street and Broadway. The place had long since gone to rack and ruin, and Santo used the ballroom's crumbling texture to create a nightclub that felt magical and timeless. Ed lit the exterior with green and purple gels, giving it an otherworldly wonderland glow. I remember seeing Rosanna sitting in a corner of the Magic Club while we were setting up lights for a shot. She was reading a script called Silverado, a Western that would become her next movie. I sensed she had mentally moved on. There was now pandemonium surrounding Madonna, since her album Like a Virgin was about to be released. In 2 weeks, she would be on the cover of Rolling Stone. A few months later, she would host Saturday Night Live and sell out Radio City Music Hall. I had never seen a career skyrocket so quickly. Just 8 weeks earlier, we'd been filming on St. Mark's Place, attracting little public attention. Now the production needed security guards. I wish I could have told Rosanna that playing Roberta Glass would bring her international fame and kudos, that it would be a film she'd be proud of decades from now. But whatever the cause of the tension between us, the push-pull resulted in a great performance, one of the most accoladed of her career. She would be nominated for a Golden Globe and win a BAFTA, the British Academy Award. But I wasn't to know that yet, so I took a deep breath, preparing myself for a possible argument, then dug my fingernail into my palm and walked toward her to discuss the scene we were about to shoot. The Way We Were, Barbra Streisand. It was now 2010, and I hadn't seen Rosanna in nearly 25 years. She was living on the West Coast, I on the East. But tonight was the 25th anniversary screening of Desperately Seeking Susan at Lincoln Center. Mark Blum and Aidan Quinn showed up. So did the producers and many of the crew members. Madonna did not. Rosanna looked beautiful and happy and had a new love in her life. Both of our careers had hit a few bumps over the years, but we were still busy working, hanging in there. And it was genuinely nice to see her and reconnect in a different way. Maybe it was maturity or empathy or a simple understanding that came with getting older. We were both now 50-ish, give or take. Or maybe it was the knowledge that we had worked together to create something memorable and unique, a film that had passed the test of time. Not many movies do. Watching the film again up on a big screen with an audience, I could see how nuanced her performance was. She was vulnerable and charming, and I appreciated all her quirky little facial expressions and great comedic timing. She was the heart of the movie, and I was glad to have the opportunity to tell her so during the Q&A that followed the screening, and again in private at the party afterward. Since that night, we've kept in touch sporadically. An occasional email, text, or Instagram message. I've followed her political activism and admired her courage to stand up to bullies, particularly the once powerful Harvey Weinstein, now inmate number 31020000153. I wished our relationship had been more convivial during the making of the film, but I'm not sure that would have made a difference. Sometimes a little tension is a good thing. Maybe it kept us both on our toes. But here I go again. I'm letting my story jump ahead of itself. So let's go back to 1984. We filmed our final shot on November 11th, 1984. The next week, I would go into the editing room for several months to work with editor Andy Monsheen. The producers would fly back to LA to focus on marketing and promotion. The production had gone relatively smoothly, with only a few minor hiccups. My spirit and confidence were still intact. Plus, I'd learned several important lessons that apply to life, not just filmmaking, especially from my mistakes. Lesson number 1. Filmmaking is about decision-making. Each shot contains the director's multiple creative decisions, which are then carried out by a large number of people: actors, designers, a camera and sound crew, wardrobe, hair and makeup teams. Be confident in your choices. But here's the thing about decisions. Sometimes you make the wrong one, and you can't be afraid to change your mind when that happens. The images you put on film will last a very long time, so make sure they are the ones you intended. Lesson number 2. It's okay to say, I don't know. If you don't know something, don't pretend you do and give a stupid answer. It will only come back to bite you in the ass. Find someone who knows the answer and ask them. In general, women seem to have an easier time saying, I don't know, and realize it's not a sign of weakness. It's simply common sense. Lesson number 3. Make friends with the hair and makeup team. They are your allies. They are the first people to greet the actors in the morning and play a crucial role in the psychological well-being of the production. They serve as therapists. They can calm down an actor who has had a romantic meltdown or been up crying or drinking or self-medicating all night. They can soothe the jitters of a performer having a panic attack. They can make pimples and under-eye bags magically disappear. They also give good neck massages. Lesson number 4. Tune out the small stuff. With so many things that can potentially go wrong, there's always an on-set crisis. Don't let it distract you. Stay focused on the big picture. Being a director is like being one of those old-timey plate spinners on the Ed Sullivan Show. You need to do a lot of running around just to keep all the plates in motion. Lesson number 5. Have a clear and solid plan for each day, then be prepared to change everything at the very last moment. Preparedness allows for spontaneous discovery on set, and always have a plan B, then a plan C. Lesson number 6. Don't ever expect to have weekends off. Lesson number 7. Respect your crew. These are the folks who get up at 4:30 a.m. every morning to beat rush hour traffic on the Long Island Expressway to make it into the city, where they work long hours behind the scenes so that the director, producers, writers, and actors can get all the glory. They are the unsung heroes of movie making, and you need to thank them every day. I also realized that directing is a physically and mentally exhausting job that is not at all glamorous, despite what outsiders might think. You find yourself shooting in lots of dirty rooms, breathing noxious fumes from oil-burning smoke machines in order to make a shot look pretty, and your face breaks out in pimples from all the grit and grime. I learned you drink tons of bad coffee because Starbucks doesn't yet exist and regular coffee is still lousy. You spend a lot of time waiting for lights to be set, cables to be laid down, and actors to get out of the hair and makeup trailer. Then you cram yourself into a tiny crawl space with 6, 7, 8 other crew members in order to get the perfect camera angle, trying to ignore the silent but toxic fart someone just expelled. There's ego massaging, psychologizing, and on-the-spot problem-solving. There's shouting about, "We're losing the light," when the sun is rapidly disappearing below the horizon and day is turning to night and you haven't finished filming the scene. And I won't say what I know or what was whispered about the personal relationships that sometimes develop on a film set. If there were any rumors floating around, they were just that, rumors, maybe mixed with a little truth and some wishful thinking. All I can say is that I now understood why actors, directors, producers, cinematographers, and various crew members sometimes find it difficult to separate their professional life from their personal life. It's the occupational hazard of a job where the hours are long, the atmosphere is emotionally charged, and the production is shrouded in fantasy. A movie set is a world of make-believe, where adults get paid well to play let's pretend. Yet despite the stress, the commotion, and the occasional battle of egos, I loved almost every minute of it. And I can't describe the euphoria I felt when the lighting was beautiful, the dolly move was perfect, the actors hit all their marks and said their lines with just the right attitude and feeling. When everyone working in front of and behind the camera was moving in sync like a beautifully choreographed ballet. You never know how the footage will come together in the editing room, but I hoped the film would have a spark of magic because I desperately wanted to do it again. Into the Groove, Madonna. Our editing suite was in the legendary Brill Building on Broadway and 49th Street. The Brill was a large, beautiful building built in 1932, with a brass plaque over the doorway in memory of the builder's son who had died in a traffic accident as a child. In the 1940s through the 1960s, its heyday, the Brill had been the center of the music publishing business. Each floor was a hive of small, independent music publishing offices, some no bigger than a closet with a piano. All the great East Coast songwriters have walked its hallways. Carole King and Jerry Goffin, Ellie Greenwich and Jeff Barry, Lieber and Stoller, Hal David, Burt Bacharach, and Neil Sedaka wrote their early hits there. Songs like It's My Party, Chapel of Love, Be My Baby, Stand By Me, and hundreds more. In the late 1960s, the music business shifted to the West Coast, so the offices were slowly turned into film editing suites. By the early 1980s, almost every major film production in New York City was edited at the Brill. A big film sound mixing studio was built on the second floor, and you never knew who you might bump into in the elevator. Woody Allen, Martin Scorsese, the Coen brothers, Francis Ford Coppola, Mike Nichols, or Elaine May, who had been editing her latest film, Ishtar, there for what seemed like years. Although Ishtar was plagued by massive cost overruns and a raging battle of egos among the three heavy-hitting participants, Elaine May, Warren Beatty, and Dustin Hoffman, it had moments of comic brilliance, but the malicious behind-the-scenes rumors created a negative buzz. As a result, the film was predestined to be a box office flop even before it was released. The tainted production took a toll on director Elaine May, who never directed another film. Andy Monsheen and his two assistants were hard at work on the 7th floor. Back then, movies were edited on celluloid, so there were bins with hanging strips of 35mm film scattered around the room. There was also a large flatbed editing machine, a Steenbeck, and an upright, old-fashioned editing machine called a Moviola. Our post-production schedule was rushed. The film was originally scheduled to come out in May or June of 1985, but Orion decided they wanted to push for a March release to take advantage of Madonna's rising fame. Secretly, they feared that Madonna's career might be over by the time the movie came out in the summer. That's how it was with female pop stars back then. They came and went in a flash. One afternoon, I got a message that Warren Beatty wanted to stop by the editing room to take a look at some footage. He was interested in possibly using Madonna in a movie he was developing. Although I wasn't eager to show the unfinished film to outsiders, how could anyone refuse Warren Beatty? Back then, few people did. So he arrived at the editing room along with his producing partner to watch some scenes we'd put together featuring Madonna. Of course, he was charming and flirty and movie star gorgeous. I could see his eyes light up as he watched Madonna on screen, like a cartoon wolf licking his chops. I don't know what events followed, because Madonna was now dating Sean Penn, and they would soon be married in a wedding splashed across newspaper headlines around the world. But 4 years later, they would divorce, and the following year, Madonna would star in Warren Beatty's 1990 film Dick Tracy, and their relationship would become public. Beatty would also appear in her 1991 documentary, Madonna, Truth or Dare, where he seemed to have turned from a wily wolf into a tame pussycat. Maybe he had met his match, a woman who could outflirt him and had both youth and unapologetic ambition on her side. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, producers Midge and Sarah were meeting with Orion executives to deal with the advertising and marketing of the movie. Many people know the difference between a director and a producer, but for those who don't, these are two distinct jobs with a little overlap. Here's some clarification for the benefit of my relatives who ask me at every family wedding or Thanksgiving dinner, "So, how's your producing coming along?" A producer deals with all the behind-the-scenes managerial aspects of financing, making, and promoting a movie. They may have originally optioned and developed the screenplay and attached the director. The director is focused on all the creative aspects of putting the story on screen, working with the writers, actors, cinematographer, designers, editor, and composer. Both the producer and director are blamed if the movie goes over budget or if the dailies look like crap. If the movie is a hit, they both take full credit. If the movie flops, they blame each other. The folks in Orion's marketing department, mostly middle-aged guys who didn't totally get the film and were at a loss about how to market it, suggested to Midge and Sarah that we change the movie's title to something more generic. They proposed the title The Personals, afraid that younger audiences, Madonna fans, would not understand what Desperately Seeking Susan meant. They were also afraid that the title would sound like a lesbian love story. Orion had designed some poster mock-ups. One featured Rosanna's face reflected on the side of a shiny metal toaster with Madonna popping out of it like a piece of toast. Thankfully, the producers fought against these silly ideas. As it happened, a young photographer named Herb Ritz had been hired to take some publicity shots of Rosanna and Madonna. They featured both women dressed in black, their messy blonde hair pulled back with big floppy bows, wearing the film's signature pyramid jacket. The background was simple, plain white. The women stood arm in arm, looking sexy and exuding attitude. Rosanna is staring defiantly at the camera. Madonna is looking away, too cool to return the viewer's gaze. At the producer's request, and with the support of a young Orion publicity guy, it was suggested that the Herb Ritz photo be turned into the poster. The image would become iconic. Meanwhile, back in the editing room, Andy had put together a solid cut of the film. We knew it still needed trimming, but we were now focused on the soundtrack. Months earlier, I had filmed a scene in Danceteria, a popular New York City club in the early 80s, one of the first to play new wave dance music. In that scene, Madonna and Mark Blum, Roberta's hot tub-selling husband, meet for the first time. The scene had originally been scripted as a dialogue scene to take place standing at the bar, but I thought it would be fun to stage it on the dance floor so that the characters danced while they talked. It was also intended as a comedic fish-out-of-water moment to show Roberta's straight suburban husband feeling out of place among the punk, goth, and gender-fluid crowd. The day before the shoot, Madonna and I had a conversation about what music might be playing in the background of the scene. She asked if she could bring in a cassette of the new song she'd written with Stephen Bray called Into the Groove. At the time, I had no intention of actually using the song in the film, but thought it would help get the background extras up on their feet. The way it works when filming a dance scene is that the music is played loudly to get all the background dancers moving to the same beat. Then the sound is turned off right before the actors start their dialogue. That way you can record the dialogue clean while the dancers move in sync, silently in the background. In the editing room, you can then substitute in whatever music you want. But Andy and I fell in love with the song. It had a great tempo, and we couldn't find anything else that worked nearly as well, so I called Madonna and told her we'd like to use her new song in the film. Of course, now that Madonna was a star, Orion was willing to pay handsomely for it. The film composer Thomas Newman came from the renowned musical Newman family. Singer-songwriter Randy Newman is his cousin. His father, Alfred, ran the music department at 20th Century Fox for decades and won 9 Academy Awards. His uncle Lionel, a conductor and composer, was nominated for 11. His older brother David would also become a well-known composer and conductor. In fact, the Newmans are the most Oscar-nominated family in movie history, with a collective total of 92 nominations. When I first met Tom, he was at the start of his career. He had scored 2 teen comedies that I wasn't particularly fond of, but on the urging of our music supervisor, I agreed to meet with him. And I'm glad I did. Music is the glue that holds a film together. It gives the movie an emotional pulse that elevates the story to a whole different level. After Tom played me a few sample riffs, I knew his score had the sense of enchantment and magic I was looking for. He would go on to create a signature sound that would influence several of his future film scores. Listen to the soundtrack of The Player and American Beauty, and maybe you'll hear it for yourself. Tom would be nominated for 15 Oscars, but as of this moment has yet to win one, although that doesn't matter when you're as talented as Tom. A studio's marketing department thinks of movie audiences in terms of quadrants: young men and boys, young women and girls, older men, older women, and by older that means anyone over 25. A studio's hope is for a film to play to as many quadrants as possible. Originally, before Madonna's stardom, the executives thought our movie would play primarily to one quadrant: older women. After all, this was a story about a suburban housewife in a passionless marriage who longs to have an adventure. But then everything changed. Madonna was extremely popular with young teenage girls, the wannabes, so that brought in another quadrant. And teenage boys liked her too, so possibly a third quadrant? Film studios often depend on market research to gauge an audience's reaction to a movie. Few executives trust their instincts, so expensive experts are brought in to run research screenings and focus groups. They put together target audiences and hand out questionnaires. But keep in mind, these questionnaires are given to a group of 400 teenagers buzzed on Skittles and Pop Rocks in a multiplex in Teaneck, New Jersey. Yet, the results can lead to the re-editing of entire portions of a movie, or the reshooting of the movie's ending at a cost of tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Around this time, Purple Rain, starring Prince, had a successful box office release. In that movie, Prince plays a struggling musician dealing with his difficult home life as he and his band try to make it in the Minneapolis club scene. The film was filled with Prince's songs from his latest album of the same name. For obvious, but wrong, reasons, the market research company decided to target a test audience that had liked Purple Rain. Other than having pop musicians as stars, the films had little in common. Purple Rain was a showcase for Prince's music. Desperately Seeking Susan was a rom-com starring 2 women. There were no concert performances and only one Madonna song in the entire film. We were nervous that marketing our movie like Purple Rain would only frustrate audiences who were expecting something different. The audience response at our first preview screening was, well, meh. Our film was not really a Madonna movie, and aggressively promoting it as such might disappoint her music fans. However, while sitting through that very awkward preview screening, the producers and I had an epiphany. Our film had the wrong ending. No, I'll rephrase that. Our film had too many endings. Audiences have been programmed to think that a rom-com ends with a kiss, because so many actually do. Once the lovers kiss and the music kicks in, the audience feels emotionally satisfied, and people begin to get up out of their seats. In Desperately Seeking Susan, there was an end-of-movie kiss, but then the story went on for another 5 minutes, and we lost the audience's attention. The original script ended with the 2 women going off together on a new adventure, leaving their men behind, sitting at a bar and pining for their return. The film's final image was of Susan and Roberta riding camels in the Egyptian desert. We actually filmed this scene in a sandpit in New Jersey with 2 rented camels from a nearby zoo. One was smelly and uncooperative and rolled over with Rosanna still on top. The producers, actresses, and I loved the idea that the film would end with the 2 women off on a new escapade together. But reality showed us that romantic comedies, even feminist ones, work best when they tug at the heartstrings. Ultimately, I think we found a satisfying ending, a romantic kiss that takes place in the projection booth of the art house movie theater where Des works as a projectionist. I staged the scene so that when the lovers kiss, they lean back against the movie projector, causing the celluloid film to jam and then melt. Their kiss literally burns up the screen. It's a romantic moment, but with a tongue-in-cheek wink. A meta way of saying, "Hey everyone, this is a movie. Enjoy." With our new ending in place, Orion submitted the film to the MPAA to get a rating. The committee in charge gave us an R. We were shocked since there was nothing R-rated about the film. Orion was particularly upset since this would impact their box office revenue. Because of Madonna's popularity with teenage girls, they wanted the film to be PG-13. The MPAA gave us a list of changes we needed to make in order to get a PG-13. Back in 1985, there were much stricter rules about what constituted each rating. For example, using inappropriate language, the F-bomb, more than 3 times in a film automatically gave you an R. We were told to change the word fucking to frigging. We had to put a dark shadow over a shot of Rosanna Arquette soaking in a bathtub because you could see her nipple through the suds. Interestingly, no comment was made about the shot where Madonna undressed in the Port Authority bathroom and her nipples show through her lacy black bra. Most of the MPAA guidelines referred to language and sexual content, not violence. You could chop someone's head off, riddle their body with bullets, beat their face to a bloody pulp, and still get a PG-13. But God forbid you showed a nipple. The film had its premiere on Friday, March 29th in LA at a movie complex in Century City, just as Madonna Mania was reaching a feverish pitch. But we kept our fingers crossed. The movie business was unpredictable. We still needed Lady Luck on our side.